Hey guys, tonight we're beginning in a quiet place. The kind of place where roofs sag with age, where wind moves without challenge, and where every chimney leans a little because no one remembers how straight it once stood. A village so ordinary it barely had a name worth carving. And in one of those damp-walled homes, between a fire that wouldn't catch and a silence that felt too practiced, a girl opened her eyes and saw more than she should have. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It always amazes me where these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. No one expected anything from her. She was born third, small, and late. Her name never made it into any preserved parish records, though her brothers' names did. Their names were inked in sharp black script, followed by words like landed, plowholder, or deceased. Hers was likely written once on a scrap of vellum folded into a drawer. That scrap, like the girl it marked, slipped past expectation. She listened more than she spoke. By the time she was 4, she could recite the entire litany from Mass, though no one had taught her to read. She noticed which floorboards creaked before they were stepped on. She remembered what colors turned in what order on the hillside when the seasons changed. When her mother misplaced the spindle, the girl didn't search for it. She walked to it. And that's where the trouble began. She noticed things she wasn't supposed to. That a local boy's miraculous healing coincided exactly with the shipment of honey root from the next town. That the chapel bell sounded slightly lower after Father Edric's apprentice repaired the rope, though no one else could hear the difference. That the Reeves ledgers didn't quite match the sacks being measured at market. You didn't say things like that. You especially didn't say them with a calm face and no understanding of why it might cause discomfort. One day, she asked why saints had gold behind their heads, not metaphorically. She wanted to know the pigment, whether it was tin or powdered saffron or some other trick she hadn't seen in the apothecary's shelf. The priest laughed nervously. The painter stopped mid-brush, and the girl simply waited for an answer. Historians still argue whether early cognitive divergence in women was punished more harshly than in men. Some suggest it was the visibility of the curiosity, the social disruption caused by simply noticing, that sparked discomfort. Others believe it was the refusal to stay quiet that marked the real boundary. The girl had not yet learned how to hide her questions. She wandered the fields alone, not to escape, but to think. She watched bees map their dances from flower to flower. She traced the way dew formed differently on flax versus barley. She noticed patterns in the sounds of birds at different hours, in the shadows cast by windowsills, in the order of stars. And then she started drawing them, not with meaning, not yet, just tracing what already existed. A sharp stick, damp wood, a line scratched into mud. Eventually, charcoal against cloth scraps or a slate stolen from behind the chapel. Swirls, grids, arcs, not pretty, not illustrative, just there. That's when the neighbors began to watch her differently. The curiosity they once called clever turned toward suspicion. She'd walk into the alehouse and people would quiet. She'd enter the chapel and a seat wouldn't be offered. She hadn't changed, but the village had decided she had. You'd feel it too if you were there. The way coldness replaces kindness, not with cruelty, but with absence. How smiles dissolve into glances. The gap between clever girl and strange one is shorter than it seems, especially when you're still young enough not to know which tone means which. One night, her brother whispered that the neighbors thought she saw things, He didn't mean ghosts. He meant too much. That she saw behind things, past what was allowed. And maybe she did. But she didn't stop. She kept asking questions, not loudly, not with rebellion, just always. And when she started leaving notes tucked into the chapel fence, small folded scraps with diagrams or thoughts about moonlight, no one knew what to do with them. They burned them, of course. But the next morning, there were more. By the time she was 10, her questions had grown teeth. They no longer came softly or by accident. They arrived with intention, as if she had learned that silence was its own kind of wrong. At the altar, she asked why saints bled in paintings, but not in life. At the well, she asked why some families drew more water than others if everyone had two hands. She didn't argue. She just asked. It was the priest who noticed first, not her intelligence, but the rhythm of it. Father Edric was not a cruel man. He had once walked half a mile in the snow to carry a widow's child to the infirmary. But he had also spent his life reciting what others had written, and the girl's questions did not fit into his margins. One day, after she asked how heaven could be above the stars if the stars moved, he took her aside and asked her gently, almost sadly, to stop asking during Mass. She blinked, not out of disobedience but confusion. He offered her a book instead, not to read, because she still hadn't been taught the Latin that ran down its spine, just to hold, to see that knowledge could live on pages, not just in questions. She turned the book in her hands and said softly, "But I already know that." She hadn't meant it with pride, but the priest flinched all the same. Historians still argue whether young women like her were ever meant to be taught formally. Some abbeys had scriptoria that allowed girls to copy scripture, but only under strict observation and with limitations on what they could read. A few noble households educated daughters in letters and astronomy, but always within the bounds of reputation. This girl had none of that. She only had the questions, and nowhere to place them. That spring, the midwife told the girl's mother to keep her from the fields. "She's too open," she said. "Things go into her and stay there." No one explained what that meant, but her mother began keeping her indoors longer. Her chores increased. She was made to tend the chickens, grind the grain, sweep behind the fire, the kind of work meant to dull the mind. It didn't. Instead, she began sketching in flour dust. Numbers, sometimes. Shapes. Tiny wheels and marks along their rims. One day, her brother saw her drawing intersecting arcs in the ashes of the hearth. "What's that?" he asked. "The moon's path," she said. He didn't speak of it again. By the age of 12, she had built a sundial out of broken spoons and a flat stone. It didn't work well. The shadow lines were uneven. But it worked enough to notice that the priest was ringing the bells slightly late every few days. She didn't correct him. Not yet. But when he preached about obedience, she raised her hand. "If a shepherd tells the sheep the grass is gone, but they can see it isn't, are they sinful to keep eating?" The chapel went quiet. Later that week, she was not invited to help polish the pews, a task she had done every spring since she could walk. She asked her mother if she'd done something wrong. "You make people feel too small," her mother whispered, "even when you don't mean to." That was the beginning of the village's verdict. They didn't say it outright, but the girl began to feel the subtle tightening of the world around her. The baker no longer gave her broken buns. The butcher began calling her lass instead of her name. When she passed the chapel, children whispered, not cruelly, but like she had become part of a story. If you were there, you'd feel it too. That peculiar weight, that presses down not with punishment, but with rejection. The way the air gets thinner around someone who doesn't fit. The silence that spreads when a question can't be answered, and so instead is feared. Still, she didn't stop asking. She wanted to know why rain smelled stronger on stone than on grass, why old people's hands trembled more on cold days, why the wind changed direction so quickly before a storm, and then she made a mistake. She asked, in the middle of the chapel square, why God allowed some minds to be faster than others. Not better, just faster. Like a wheel, she said. Some turn quicker. That's not pride. That's just turning. A woman crossing the square dropped her basket. The priest did not scold her, not aloud. But a week later, he asked her mother if she might consider apprenticing the girl as a laundress in the next town over. Get her among people who aren't so used to her, he said. But her mother refused. She's not ready to leave, she said. She was wrong. The girl was already leaving, in a way, stepping out of the lanes that had been drawn for her, tracing new ones with invisible chalk. No one taught her how to read. No one taught her how to chart the stars. But she had begun to do both. And when the scribe arrived later that summer, it would be her hands that found their way to the margins. By 13, she was no longer spoken of as a child. The women at the well called her the strange one. The boys at the chapel stopped teasing her, not out of respect, but discomfort. A few older villagers simply stopped using her name. There's a space that opens between girlhood and womanhood when you're too clever, and she found herself in it alone. She was not considered beautiful, not in the ways they measured such things then. Her hair was never brushed properly. Her fingers were always stained with ash or ink or something harder to name. Her skirts were patched too often, and her gaze lingered too long on things that didn't belong to her. She had no prospects, no apprenticeship, no engagement, not because she was poor, but because she was impossible. When the midwife spoke of her again, it was with finality. She won't marry, she said, not unless he's madder than she is. The statement was met with a few soft laughs, but not from the girl's mother, who had begun to watch her daughter the way one watches a fire too far from the hearth. It wasn't just her questions anymore. It was the way she spoke of time. She'd taken to measuring it, in shadows, in candle stubs, in the curling of leaves. She'd carved tiny notches along a plank nailed behind the cottage, charting how the sun shifted by season. She'd calculated, roughly, how many steps it took to walk from the chapel to the river, and how many breaths it took for the moon to clear the tree line after dusk. And then she started correcting people, not out of malice, but reflex. "That's not true," she said to the butcher when he claimed rain came from angels' sorrow. Rain is pulled from the sea and pushed by pressure. No one knew what that meant, but they remembered it. She told the baker that yeast was alive, told the carpenter his window frames would swell because he'd chosen pine, not oak, told the priest that a verse he'd recited from memory had swapped 2 words. She wasn't wrong, but she was becoming intolerable. Historians still argue whether women in rural Europe had any true social leverage during adolescence. Some point to records of young girls managing estates in the absence of fathers, or acting as midwives before formal adulthood. But others note how quickly that power evaporated when it wasn't accompanied by compliance or charm. She had neither. And so they tried to fix her. The priest suggested scripture. The reeve offered an apprenticeship with the herb woman, hoping that physical labor might dull the edge of her mind. Her mother began insisting on chores at sunrise, hoping tired hands would quiet a restless head. Nothing worked. What no one saw, or perhaps refused to see, was that her questions weren't arrogance. They were grief. She was mourning the world as it had been taught to her, mourning that no one else seemed to want to know why. She began to walk farther, past the fields, past the creek, into the thickets where only gatherers went, and only by day. She collected things, mosses, feathers, bones. She kept them in boxes under her bed, labeled not with words, but symbols of her own. And she drew, not doodles, but patterns, fractals, structures, things that resembled machines, though she had never seen one. She drew diagrams of stars she'd only seen once and repeated them as if they meant something. She asked the priest if numbers were holy. Why? He asked, guarded. Because they stay the same even when no one believes in them. He did not answer, but he began watching her more closely. By midsummer, her drawings had been found. Tucked into the chapel fence, hidden under the pew, scrawled on the backs of used parchment sheets. One made it into the almanac. She had corrected it, not the theology, but the calculations. The chart for planting had been copied incorrectly by a traveling steward, and she had rewritten the lunar cycle with better spacing and notations. The steward found it in his satchel 3 days after leaving. He returned. He did not say why. He asked to see the girl. The priest said she was not well. The steward left without arguing. A week later, the sheriff received a notice. Suspicious alteration of documents in the parish of Elversbrook. The letter did not name her, but it didn't have to. The priest called her to the chapel. He did not scold her. He just sat with her in the cold quiet and asked if she understood what she'd done. She said yes. Then why? He asked. Because it was wrong, she said, and I could make it better. He closed his eyes, not in anger, in resignation. You can't fix everything, he said. She thought about that for a moment. Then I'll fix what I can reach. If you had been there, sitting in that stone chapel, the wax smoke still curling near the rafters, you would have seen it. The moment she shifted from being a girl with questions to something more dangerous, not because she was right, but because she knew it and no longer asked permission to be. The almanac incident was never officially recorded, not in any surviving church logs, nor in the manorial scrolls. But it lived on in other forms, in a black smudge on the edge of a prayer bench where she used to sit, in the quiet hush that followed when her name was mentioned, and in the way people began locking drawers that had never needed locks before. It wasn't just that she had corrected the steward's chart. It was that she'd done it invisibly, without ceremony, and with such precision that the error could no longer be denied. The planting guide had listed the wrong date for the waxing moon. Her version aligned with the stars. Worse still, her amendment had improved it. Even the steward couldn't argue that. What frightened people most wasn't her knowledge. It was her audacity. Afterward, she was watched. The shepherds eyed her when she crossed the meadow. The baker's wife stopped answering her questions about yeast. Even the priest, who had once tried to gently contain her mind, began locking the church after Vespers. She still came. She'd sit on the stone steps of the chapel, her skirts dusted with chalk, her fingers busy drawing circles into the frost with a stick. She didn't try to explain anymore. She just kept looking, at shadows, at clouds, at the patterns the birds made when they wheeled away from rooftops in the wind. That winter, she was summoned. Not formally, just a message slipped into her mother's hand. The sheriff's steward wanted to speak with her, privately, at the hall. It was not a request. Historians still argue whether this particular summons constituted a warning, a punishment, or something stranger. No trial records exist. No charges were ever recorded. Some believe it was an interrogation under the guise of curiosity. Others say it was an early test, to see how far an outlier could be pushed before she either broke or bent. She did neither. She went alone. Her mother begged to accompany her, but the girl refused. "They're not interested in you," she said. "They want to measure me." The steward did not ask her to sit. He paced. He asked her what she knew about the stars. She told him what she had observed, no more, no less. He asked where she'd learned it. She said, "By looking." He asked if she could read. She hesitated, then nodded. That was the moment. His gaze sharpened. Not angry, calculating. He asked if she'd ever seen a book she wasn't meant to see. She said, "Every book is meant to be seen. Or why write it?" He told her to leave. When she returned home, her mother wept and held her like she was already gone. And maybe, in some way, she was. Something had changed, not visibly, but beneath the skin of the village. The air around her had thickened. She no longer asked questions aloud. She wrote them instead, and the writings began to travel. At first, it was a page tucked into the almanac, then a slip of charcoal-smudged vellum wedged into the herb woman's ledger, a diagram on the back of a prayer card. No one claimed them. But a wandering scribe, a man whose name was never preserved, took notice. He had passed through the village before, sold a few copied psalters, shared ink with the reeve, slept in the hayloft behind the tavern. But this time, he left with more than he brought. Tucked into his satchel were 5 pieces of parchment bearing the girl's hand, marked with circles, annotations, and something close to equations. He didn't know who had drawn them, but he knew they didn't belong here, and so he carried them onward. By spring, those same margins, her margins, would begin appearing in other manuscripts, not as main text, but as ink-wrapped oddities, drawings squeezed between verses, theories blooming behind benedictions, a forgotten girl's mind blooming in spaces not meant for her. Back in the village, she remained uncredited. Of course she did. Girls like her weren't meant to be remembered, but the whispers began to shift. No longer just warnings. Now, fascination. She sees things. She draws what hasn't happened yet. She knows when the moon will cry. She didn't stop. Couldn't. Not anymore. When she found her chalk gone one morning, she didn't weep. She went to the stream and collected black stones instead. She crushed them herself, ground them to powder, and mixed them with the fat from a cracked egg. Her fingers were black for a week, but she kept writing. If you passed her in those days, you might not have noticed her. She'd grown quieter, her face thinner, her posture slightly hunched from hours leaning over stone and cloth. But her eyes remained lit, like she was seeing something you couldn't. And maybe she was. The scribe who carried her pages west had no title to protect them. He was not attached to a monastery, nor a university, nor even a reputable press. He copied what people paid him to copy, psalms, herbals, contracts. But he had an eye for the unusual. And something in those diagrams, in the margins he'd lifted from Elversbrook, stirred him in a way scripture no longer could. He didn't understand them, not entirely, but he sensed the shape of a mind pressing out from the ink. Not a mind mimicking Holy Writ or court decrees, but one trying, earnestly, to understand the mechanics of the world. Not with faith, with observation. And so he copied them. Carefully, patiently. into the corners of folios and backs of hymnals, sometimes in red ink, sometimes in water-dark ash. He never signed them, but he never forgot them either. One of those hymnals made its way into the library of a small monastery south of York, and that is where the marginalia first caused trouble. A monk, elderly, near blind, mistook one of her diagrams for a corruption. He claimed the pattern matched pagan marks he'd seen once in a confiscated Nordic scroll. Another monk said it looked like a sun wheel. A third argued it was merely geometry. They burned the page, but not before copying it into their forbidden archive. Historians still debate whether the girl from Elversbrook had any idea her drawings had traveled that far. There's no evidence she ever left her region, at least not in a way the tax rolls or death records acknowledge. But by 1340, at least 3 known texts bear her distinctive marks in the margins, scattered far from her home and never attributed. Back in the village, she had grown more cautious. She no longer left her diagrams in the chapel. Too many had been taken, crumpled, or scraped clean. Instead, she began hiding them. In chimney flues, inside hollow fence posts, behind loose stones in the chapel wall, places where they might not be found for years, or might never be found at all. Her body was still rooted in the village, but her mind had started slipping outward, unfolding like smoke from a hidden fire. One day, she passed a parchment to the herb woman's apprentice. It bore a drawing of a leaf, not its shape, but its veins, numbered and mapped in ink. "It has a rhythm," she said, "a kind of pulse." The apprentice said nothing, but she kept the page, and that is how it began, the quiet scattering of her thought, not as lecture, not as doctrine, just fragments, handed from girl to girl, woman to woman, folded into baskets and tucked behind shutters. The priest still watched her. So did the reeve, but neither intervened. Not yet. She had grown taller, not graceful, but striking. Her eyes rarely blinked when she spoke. She walked with the slight forward lean of someone always pulled toward the next idea. And she rarely smiled, not because she was sad, but because she was thinking. When the scribe returned, almost 2 years later, he didn't ask for her. He left a packet at the chapel door, a satchel with vellum scraps, a small sealed inkwell, and a note that read only, "Others saw." She found it before dawn. She didn't open it right away. She carried it to the river and sat with it in her lap for hours, listening to the water pulling at the reeds. When she finally unwrapped the bundle, she didn't cry, but she did laugh, once, quietly, because one of the copied pages was hers, drawn years earlier in charcoal and fat, now mirrored back to her in someone else's neat red ink. And for the first time, she felt it. Her thinking was no longer a secret. It had moved beyond her hands. It had been carried. You'd feel it too if you were there. That odd warmth that comes when a truth you once whispered now echoes back from farther away. The feeling of being witnessed by someone you've never met. She didn't tell anyone about the packet, not even her mother. She simply tucked it into the floorboards, beneath the box of bones and feathers, and began drawing again. Not faster, not more urgently, but with a new stillness, because now she knew. The questions she asked were not just hers. They were finding their way into the world, whispers, at first. They began in the tavern, low voices over stale ale, men with calloused hands mentioning, almost idly, that the strange girl had been seen walking out past the boundary stone with ink on her cheeks and a scroll clutched like it was gold. Then it spread to the chapel, where a serving girl noticed that the priest paused longer than usual before his readings as if he were distracted or waiting for something. It wasn't a secret that her pages had started moving beyond the village. What unsettled people was that she hadn't been stopped. The steward still rode through once a month. He spoke less now. He'd glance at her door when passing, but never dismounted. Some said he was afraid of what she might say. Others thought he was just waiting for a reason. But the real attention didn't come from the officials. It came from people without names, ones who asked questions that echoed hers, who had heard of a girl who drew stars without a map, who wrote about wind as if it had logic. A tanner's apprentice from a nearby town claimed he'd met her, that she'd explained the tilt of a weathercock and why the crows circled in spirals before a frost. No one believed him, but the story traveled anyway. In the records, this moment is barely a shadow, just a notation in a crumbling village inventory that mentions increased visits from outside parish youth. But it was more than that. People were coming, not many, never in groups, but one by one, like moths drawn not to flame, but to the quiet light of someone thinking in a way they'd never seen before. She didn't teach them, not in the way schools did. She showed them. She asked them questions. And when they didn't know the answers, she'd pause and ask if they wanted to try finding out. One girl, nameless in the records, returned 3 times. Each time she brought something, a pine cone with a strange growth, a feather shaped like a crescent, a broken mirror. The girl from Elversbrook kept them all. The priest grew more withdrawn. He no longer confronted her, but he watched her with a sadness that looked like prophecy, as if he knew this would not last, that something this open could not be allowed to go on. Still, she walked the village with her head up, not defiantly, just unafraid. And that's when the threats began. Not loudly, not from officials, just subtle shifts. A missing stool from her stoop, a torn sketch under her doorstep, a bucket of water upturned onto a cache of dried ink. Someone, or someones, wanted to remind her she could be made small again. She didn't react, but she started hiding her writings better. She stopped drawing in public. Her face, always calm, became unreadable. Historians still argue whether this resistance came from the church, local politics, or fear from villagers who believed knowledge too large could be dangerous. What's certain is that her influence had started to ripple, and with it came the inevitable tide of suppression. You could feel it in the air, something tightening, folding inward, like breath held too long. And then, one morning, she was gone. The hearth cold, the bed empty, her satchels untouched, but her shoes missing. No signs of struggle, just absence. Her mother said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th, she lit a candle and placed it in the chapel, though no prayer was spoken. The priest announced nothing. The steward did not come. The village simply continued, quieter than before. But stories don't end when people disappear. They change. Soon, rumors bloomed. She'd been taken to a monastery. She'd fled to France with a scholar. She'd been hidden by a noble family to teach their daughters. She'd walked into the woods and never come out. One boy claimed he saw her coat nailed to the boundary tree. Another said he'd heard her voice in a well. Neither tale held, but both were repeated. And then something stranger happened. Her pages kept appearing. Weeks after her disappearance, a folded parchment was found behind the chapel altar. It bore a diagram of a human hand, veins mapped, knuckles marked like constellations. No one knew how it got there. 2 months later, a shepherd found another, wedged into the gatepost of a nearby farm. This one was a drawing of wind paths with a note beside it. The hill speaks first when storms come. Listen. They couldn't explain it, but they couldn't ignore it either. It was as if she had vanished from sight, but not from movement, like her thoughts had grown wings and scattered in her absence. A few villagers whispered that she hadn't left. She had simply changed where she could be seen. No one agreed on how long she was gone. Some said a season, others nearly a year. But the records, such as they are, offer nothing concrete. Her name doesn't appear in parish rolls, in fines or alms lists, nor in any recorded death. There's a blank where she should have been, as if the village had collectively closed its eyes. But stories are harder to silence than people. The farmer's wife in the next parish over claimed to have seen her, hair hidden under a scarf, passing through a market with a basket of roots and a face too familiar to forget. A traveler from the coast swore a girl matching her description sold him a pair of wax tablets inscribed with circles he couldn't decipher. A monk wrote of a quiet servant in a scriptorium who rearranged his desk papers while he was out, and when he returned, the calendar was correct for the first time in months. These stories didn't match, but they spread. They called her the disappearing girl, not because she'd vanished, but because she'd begun appearing in too many places at once, never long enough to be certain, never close enough to prove. Historians still argue whether this was myth-making or clever disguise. Some suggest she took on another name. Others believe multiple girls adopted her patterns and ideas, amplifying the legend while obscuring its origin. A few scholars think she never left the village at all, that her silence was a kind of burial, and the world simply moved around her until she rose again as someone new. Then, one day, she returned. Not dramatically. No one saw her arrive. One morning, her hearth was warm again. Her door re-hung, her mother hanging damp cloth on the line, humming in a voice too steady for someone who'd grieved. She had changed, not older, but sharpened. Her gaze no longer wandered, it observed. She moved through the village without fear, but also without explanation. She didn't reclaim her place. She walked through it like a guest who knew the old furniture but no longer sat in it. When the priest saw her again, he did not speak, just nodded once, then turned away. Her mother called her by her name, once, while stirring a pot. The girl didn't answer, but later that night, she cleaned the hearth. Whatever had happened during her absence, it had carved something new into her. She spoke little, but she wrote more than ever. Not in charcoal or chalk now, in ink. Precise, controlled, bound into stitched books with thread she twisted herself. She no longer hid her drawings. She wrapped them in linen and stacked them beneath the cot. She didn't share them, not yet, but they existed, complete in a way they hadn't been before. A new diagram appeared on her door, a wheel with 7 spokes, each marked with a symbol that didn't match any known language. When asked about it, she simply said, "It helps me remember." That was all. But within a month, 2 more doors in the village bore similar marks. One was the shepherd's daughter, the girl who had once brought feathers and pine cones. The other was a midwife's niece, barely 9, who began speaking in patterns that mimicked constellations. She had become something else now, not just strange, not just clever, a symbol. You would have felt it had you been there. The way her presence no longer unsettled, it organized. She had gone beyond the village's categories, no longer child, no longer threat. Something older than both, and quieter, and that made her dangerous in a different way. The reeve resumed taking notes. The priest began preaching longer homilies about order and obedience, and the steward returned, asking questions with more urgency than before. But the girl answered none of them, because now her thoughts were not just in her head, they were folded into the minds of others. Not loud, not many, but enough. The village didn't know whether she had disappeared or multiplied, and perhaps she had done both. Her name no longer appeared in any official records, not under her family, not under the parish, yet somehow she continued to exist, not in the formal scrolls, but in the marginalia. A mark here, a note there, a wheel tucked into the corner of a field ledger, a folded page behind a chapel hymn. One such appearance came from a particularly curious place, a royal workshop inventory listing instruments unfit for use, sundials, compasses, star charts copied with errors. Scrawled in the margin, in a steadier hand than the clerk's, was a correction to the angle of a quadrant and a single phrase. She measures better than most men dream. The hand didn't match any court official. Some believe this was the moment she returned under another name. Because soon after, in the city of Hereford, a copyist began signing their work with a peculiar monogram, a woven symbol of two circles intersecting with a vertical line through both. The same symbol, in fact, that had been carved into the door of the girl's cottage after she came back. The copyist was never formally identified. Their work was attributed to anonymous scribes under ecclesiastical review. But something in the flourishes, in the repeated celestial diagrams, in the margin notes correcting astronomical assumptions, it all pointed back to her. She had become untraceable by name, but unmistakable by hand. In the years that followed, new manuscripts began to circulate, not widely, but persistently. A book on the healing properties of wind, a treatise describing the musical ratios of bells when frozen, diagrams of moons drawn not in ideal spheres, but in their actual, warped shapes. They weren't credited, but the same woven symbol appeared in most of them. Back in the village, she no longer attended chapel. Her mother passed quietly during an early frost, and though the priest offered prayers, the girl didn't come to the burial. She remained in her cottage, smoke curling from the hearth, pages rustling behind shuttered windows. And yet, she was everywhere. A steward in the next shire reported that a young man of indistinct features had corrected his ledger formula before slipping away without giving a name. A merchant's son from Exeter swore he had found a wheel diagram under the flap of a grain sack that explained the moisture content better than any church almanac. A nun at a coastal priory wrote, in her journal, of a girl who came in the night and left behind only a ribbon-wrapped scroll marked with star paths. Historians still argue whether this name-swapping, identity-blurring was a survival tactic or a deliberate attempt to fracture authorship. Some say it was the only way for her to move freely in a world that didn't know how to read her. Others believe it was something more radical, that she was seeding ideas beyond the bounds of ego, that she wanted her thoughts, not her name, to live. And live they did. Even the astronomer Theobald Larsen, whose notes became foundational to early English star maps, scribbled in the margin of his 1343 manuscript, "Credit the folding girl, her wheels turn true." No further explanation, no mention again. Folding girl. It was the only time the word girl appeared in his writings. Back in her village, most had stopped trying to explain her. New children grew up hearing stories of the quiet witch, the girl who vanished, or the one who sees too much. They didn't understand that she still lived among them, that she ate their bread, crossed their paths, watched their fields grow. She had become invisible the way gravity is, not absent, but foundational. Her door still bore the wheel. One day, A young boy from the mill placed a folded scrap beneath it. He had drawn an animal's footprint and written in clumsy script, "Why do they curve this way?" She never answered aloud, but the next day the boy found a smooth stone at the foot of his bed. Carved on its surface, the same arc as the paw print, surrounded by notes. She was teaching now, in silence. She was becoming many. The fire began in the southeast quarter of the manor. Just before dawn, when frost still clung to the thatch and the animals hadn't yet stirred. Smoke rose in delicate columns, too thin at first to cause alarm. But by the time the bell rang, not the chapel's, but the one tied to the Reeves' own wrist for emergencies, it was too late. The records hall burned completely. It had stood for nearly 80 years, a squat timber building housing not just taxes and names, but the administrative soul of the village. In it, almanacs, church records, land plots, punishment ledgers, grain tallies, rainfall scrolls, and copies of every decree that had passed through Elversbrook since the reign of the king's grandfather. Gone. When the villagers gathered at the blackened site, they stared not just at ash and timber, but at absence. No one said her name, but many thought it. Only a week earlier, she had asked the Reeve to see a page from the planting records. He had refused, not harshly, but with that flat sort of tone used when denial feels righteous. And now, there was nothing to refuse. The steward arrived within hours. Unlike his usual visits, this time he stayed. He questioned the Reeve, the priest, the night watch, even the miller's deaf son. No one admitted to seeing anyone near the hall. No lanterns, no footsteps, no strange movements in the dark. The steward walked the ruins for nearly an hour, poking through wet ash with a cane he didn't need, before pausing at a piece of scorched vellum. A corner remained intact, part of a lunar diagram, incomplete but unmistakable. He pocketed it without a word. Historians still debate whether the fire was an act of arson, sabotage, or simple misfortune. Some claim the building had rotting joists and that a dropped candle could have sparked it. Others believe it was deliberate, not to destroy knowledge, but to erase its limits, to open the world by burning the cage. Either way, the damage was done. The village was unmoored. Without records, nothing could be verified. Who owned what? Who owed what? Who had planted which seeds when? The priest's sermon the following Sunday was notably vague. No names were read aloud, no penance assigned, and in the quiet that followed, something shifted. A girl at the chapel began sketching notes into the margins of her psalter. A boy near the forge fashioned a ring marked with small stars, not religious, not decorative, just precise. The old herb woman took to measuring wind direction with a strip of dyed linen, checking it at different times each day. They didn't call it science. They didn't call it anything. But they were listening, and not to the steward. The girl, the folding one, as she was now sometimes called in whispers, had grown quieter still. She spoke less, not from fear, but clarity. Her work had changed. No longer scattered pages or improvised diagrams. She had begun assembling them, bound into volumes, each wrapped in waxed linen. She buried the first one herself, near the chapel, in a hollow where the roots of a dying yew split open like fingers. No marker, no ceremony, but the priest saw her do it. He didn't stop her. He didn't speak. He watched her press the soil back into place, then disappear into the mist like she had always belonged to it. When he returned to his quarters that night, he found a diagram beneath his door, a wheel within a wheel, and in its center, a mirror. He stared at it for a long time. Then he tucked it inside his psalter and never mentioned it again. What followed was a slow unraveling of certainty. The steward made lists, but no one could verify them. The tax records were recreated from memory, but half the names were guessed. Boundaries of land blurred. One family refused to pay, saying they'd already paid last year, and no one could prove otherwise. The village had entered a strange new state, where knowledge, once confined to paper, now lived in people. Shaky, inexact, but alive. The folding girl did not speak of the fire, but her diagrams grew more complex afterward. Nested systems, interlocking sequences, notes in a new kind of shorthand that others could almost read. And her pages kept spreading, folded into the hems of cloaks, slipped between bread deliveries, tucked behind water barrels. They didn't always make sense. Some were fragments, some were instructions. Some were just drawings of breath patterns in sleeping animals. But they carried something, a kind of permission. Not to believe, but to notice. Spring came late that year. The frost lingered past the feast of St. Mark, and even the hedgerows seemed hesitant to green. When the thaw finally did arrive, it brought not renewal, but silence, a strange, muffled hush that settled over the village like snow never could. The steward had stopped coming. Not officially. His absence was never announced. But week after week, the riders passed by Elversbrook without pausing. The road grew wilder. The hedge along the parish line went unclipped. A year earlier, such neglect would have been unthinkable. Now it was met with something close to relief. Without oversight, the village did not collapse. It rearranged. There were no new decrees, so old ones faded. No new tithes, so food was shared differently. No new scrolls, so memory became law. And still, her work continued. Not in the open, not entirely, but less hidden than before. A new wheel appeared carved into the side of the well. A slate board, marked with arcs and tiny sunbursts, was nailed to the schoolhouse wall. When asked who put it there, the children only smiled. At night, her cottage sometimes glowed faintly, not with fire, but with some reflection of ink and candlelight and motion. A flicker of shadow against parchment, as if she was not writing so much as unfolding something from the air. One of the bakers began delivering loaves in baskets lined with her notes. Not all the loaves, just 1 or 2 per week. Always different households. No explanation. A gift or a test. A young shepherd found a folded map under a stone, not of terrain, but of birds. It showed where they nested, how they flew, what winds carried them when. He memorized it. He still couldn't read, not in the traditional sense, but he understood the sky better after that. You would have felt it, being there, how thought had begun to drift like pollen, landing, rooting, blooming. Historians still argue whether this marked the beginning of a movement or the final echoes of a mind trying to outpace its erasure. Some claim these fragments formed the backbone of later naturalist texts. Others insist they were simply the dreams of a clever girl, scattered like seeds in a wind too strong to trace. What we do know is this. By midsummer, the girl no longer walked alone, not because others followed her, but because they walked their own paths now, ones she'd opened. The blacksmith's daughter built a water clock from a hollow log and 4 spoons. The miller's boy learned to time the grain sifting by the sound of insects outside. A pair of twins began scratching out codes in the frost before dawn, hoping to trap the patterns of weather. And through all this, the girl did not lead. She observed. She listened to how knowledge echoed when no one claimed it, how it shaped itself in the mouths of those who discovered it by accident and believed they were the first. She had never wanted credit, only motion. One afternoon, a page appeared in the chapel again, left not by her hand, but someone else's. It was crude, written in charcoal, with misaligned stars and an unsteady compass rose. But it was undeniably an attempt. The priest did not burn it. He folded it and placed it behind the altar. Later, he would add another, his own attempt at mapping the hours of prayer according to the shadows cast by the nave windows. It was imprecise, and he admitted that, but he left it anyway. Something had changed, not just in the girl, in the village. It had become a place where questions could be asked without punishment. Not all questions, not loudly, but enough. The girl's diagrams were now kept in pockets, in satchels, sometimes sewn into hems. Not to hide them, to carry them. Pieces of a language still being formed. And in quiet corners of the region, other villages began reporting similar things. A child who could predict frost. A teenager who mapped lunar cycles without a chart. A widow who wrote symbols on her shutters that mirrored the folding girl's wheels. No one knew where she had been taught. They didn't know that long ago, in a village nearly forgotten, a girl too smart to remain small had started drawing the shape of thought itself and letting it go. By the time autumn settled over Elversbrook again, her name was no longer spoken with caution, but with care. Not reverence, exactly. Something quieter. Like when you mention a river in drought season, knowing it's still there, somewhere, even if you can't hear it moving. The villagers had adjusted to the absence of oversight. With no steward and no taxes formally collected, the rhythms of obligation had shifted. People gave what they could, took what they needed, and the reeve, who had once been meticulous about who owed which grains and goats, stopped tallying altogether. Instead, he began writing other things. At first, it was just weather, rainfall patterns, which fields bloomed early, which ones failed, then the behavior of geese, later, the shapes of hoarfrost on rooftops. He didn't share these notes, but he didn't burn them either, and sometimes, when he passed her on the lane, he tipped his head, almost as if to say, "I see now." She kept walking. She never responded to gestures. She had become something like a shadow that warmed rather than cooled, a presence whose influence was stronger when she wasn't being watched. That winter, a new pattern emerged. Stones. Small ones placed carefully, stacked or spiraled or tucked into crevices around the village, on the chapel sill, beneath the tavern bench, inside the baker's cold oven. Each bore a single etching, a dot, a line, a tiny notch, meaningless on their own, but slowly, some began to piece them together. A boy laid them out in his attic and discovered that when aligned by notch direction, they described the arc of the sun across solstice days. A weaver mirrored the same configuration in her thread tension and found a way to reduce winter slack by half. None of this was in a book. None of it was claimed, but it had the feel of her. Historians still argue whether these stones were her doing or simply an echo, villagers mimicking her method without knowing it. Some say she placed them. Others say the village had been taught to see patterns, and now they found them everywhere. Whatever the truth, something had changed. The village had become a kind of living text, not a story to be read, but one that rewrote itself. Even the chapel, once silent and stiff, began to soften. The priest opened his doors earlier, lit candles for longer, and during a sermon on the feast of St. Catherine said aloud, "Sometimes, wisdom arrives quietly, and we mistake it for disruption." He didn't name her. He didn't need to. In the back pew, a girl, not the girl, but another, smiled. The folding girl herself had grown thinner, her hair longer, darker. She seemed to spend more time near the edges of the village now, walking the tree lines, watching the hills. Not withdrawn, exactly, but less fixed, as if her shape could no longer be held entirely by the village that first tried to break it. And then the letter arrived. No one knew who brought it. It wasn't sealed, just folded, tied with cord, and left at her door. She opened it with steady fingers. Inside, a request. No signature, just coordinates, or what passed for coordinates in a pre-cartographic age. A place, a time, a question. She read it once, then again, then burned it in her hearth. That night, she packed. Only a few things: ink, a roll of blank parchment, a vial of powder, and one stone, not carved, just smooth. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't leave a note. But she didn't hide her departure either. She walked out before dawn while the village slept. And though she made no sound, someone heard her. By morning, her door bore a new mark. 3 concentric circles brushed in pale ash. No one touched it. The girl had not vanished. She had, once again, folded herself into the world. And just like before, she was never truly gone. By the time the first copy of The Folding Stars surfaced, no one knew who had written it. Bound in pale hide, stitched with a thread of indigo-dyed flax, it carried no signature, no title page, no dedication. Just diagrams, precise, impossible, beautiful, circles within circles, lattices of force, pages that seemed to hum when turned, not with sound, but with weight. It wasn't the sort of book one found in monasteries. It wasn't shelved. It was passed, hand to hand, like a confession. The first confirmed sighting came from a small priory near the coast, where a novice reported discovering it wrapped in a shawl beneath a bench. She couldn't read it, not all of it, but she recognized the mark pressed into the final page. A wheel intersected with a mirror. Others followed. One surfaced in the north, in the home of a stonemason's widow, who claimed it had arrived in a basket of potatoes. She didn't question it. She kept it wrapped in a cloth and placed it near her fire each night, saying it made the dreams calmer. A third appeared in Paris decades later, too advanced to have been born of that century. Scholars debated its origin, but none could find its author. The parchment was northern, the inks mixed with something untraceable. The hand, unmistakable. Historians now agree that The Folding Stars was hers, or at least seeded by her. Its ideas, cycles of breath and pattern, light refracted through dust, the weight of memory in cold stone, bore her quiet precision. Her refusal to name things before she understood them. Her habit of marking truth with question, never certainty. But there were changes too. New notations, foreign scripts, pages referencing events she could not have witnessed, unless she had traveled farther than anyone believed. Some scholars argue she had apprentices. Others say the book was collaborative, a kind of growing text, added to by minds she had touched. No central author, just central gravity, and in that way, it became dangerous. By the 1370s, certain bishops had banned it outright. Not by name, it had no name, but by shape. Any manuscript bearing the triple circle seal was to be destroyed. Many were, but not all, because by then it had spread beyond books. Tailors began stitching the wheel into cuffs and linings. Bakers etched it into loaves for feast days. Children scrawled it in frost on chapel glass. The folding girl had become folklore, but not the kind told at firesides. The kind that makes people nervous. One nobleman claimed a maid under his employ had begun drawing her own calendars, better than the estate almanac. When questioned, she only said, The stars don't lie when you listen. He sent her away. The same year, a physician from Bruges published a pamphlet describing breath rhythms that mirrored some of the diagrams found in the banned books. He claimed no influence, but in the margin of his personal copy, someone later found the mirror mark, etched faintly in graphite. She had become untraceable again. Not gone, just impossible to follow. You'd have seen it if you were there. How she moved now like weather. Not in straight lines, in waves, in wind. And back in Elversbrook, the village changed with her. The chapel removed the last of the tithing records. The reeve no longer marked fields by ownership, but by what grew best there. The blacksmith began weighing horseshoes not just by iron, but by the sound they made when dropped on stone. And no one spoke her name. Not because it was feared, because it was shared. She had become many hands, many voices, many small observations stitched into the corners of daily life. No one could point to her house anymore, because it was the whole village. By the time the next generation came of age, the village had forgotten how it began. Not completely, not in the sense of absence, but the girl who once walked their lanes, arms full of ink-stained scrolls and questions too wide for their years, had become something blurred, a presence pressed into ritual, not memory. The children knew her, but not by name. They played games called the folding, where they'd draw wheels in the dirt and whisper riddles meant to be solved not with answers, but with noticing. They hung strings in the trees, watching how wind curled them, how light passed through the knots. No one told them to. They just did. And the old people, those few who remembered her shadow along the chapel wall, said nothing. Not because they didn't care, because the silence was part of it now. A quiet honoring. Once a year, on the shortest day, someone would leave a folded note in the hollow of the chapel's yew tree. Never signed. Sometimes a question, sometimes a pattern. One year, just a drawing of a sleeping fox and the words, "What heat is left in stillness." The priest, long changed, would find them, place them in the altar drawer, and never speak of them. This was how remembering looked now, without mention, without claim, only continuity. And yet, beyond the village, the story took a different turn. In towns farther off, her tale became a warning. She was too clever, they'd whisper. She knew too much. The moral shifted, not toward admiration, but restraint. Girls in neighboring parishes were scolded for asking too many questions. One was forbidden from using charcoal. Another had her drawings taken and burned. All were told the same thing. Cleverness in silence is survival. Cleverness aloud is a curse. So the story fractured. In Elversbrook, she was a murmur, a rhythm under their breath, a wheel traced in meal dust on a wooden floor. Outside, she was a lesson. Don't be too smart, don't stand too tall, don't fold thought where others can see. And still, she spread, not through rebellion, but through utility. A midwife in a port city used a diagram remarkably similar to the folding girls to monitor breath during childbirth. She never claimed invention, just said it worked. A boy in a mountain village arranged stones in the same triple spiral pattern found in the folding stars, despite never having left his home. A scribe in Avignon copied a page of obscure mathematical notes and left, in the margin, the phrase, "She was right about the bell." What bell? No one knows. The note remains. Historians still argue whether these appearances are proof of a unified legacy or the human tendency to draw lines between stars that don't connect. Some believe she lived on through secret networks of thinkers. Others insist she was myth, a construct of coincidence, hope, and grief. But in Elversbrook, no one argued. They had no need for proof. The fields were still measured by wind. The forge still used sound. The chapel windows still caught frost like breath. Her name wasn't spoken, but when the wheel creaked on its chain above the well, when the stars aligned just so above the rooftops, when a child solved a problem with no clear source, they knew. She had never left. She had only folded. In time, the scholars returned. Not in cloaks or collars, but with questions. Parchment. Ink that dried too quickly in the northern wind. They came from towns that barely remembered the name Elversbrook, asking for stories they didn't believe and hoping to find relics that had never been relics to begin with. They didn't understand the girl. Not really. They wanted her to be a figure, a heroine, a threat, something tidy. But what they found were echoes. A folded page beneath the floorboards of the chapel, a door frame carved faintly with a wheel, a memory from an old woman who remembered her mother whispering that cleverness was a kind of prayer. The scholars catalogued these things. They didn't know what to make of them. Unverifiable, they wrote in their ledgers. Possibly folkloric. But one of them, a younger one with smudged glasses and a habit of staring too long at shadows, lingered. He stayed through the winter. He didn't ask much. He helped the miller's son repair a broken axle, spent mornings near the well, watching light on the surface, afternoons in the chapel, where the wind curled beneath the eaves, and one morning he left behind a notebook. He didn't take it with him, just placed it beneath the altar. The priest, an old man by then, with hands like dried leaves, found it days later. Inside were sketches, notes, diagrams drawn from memory, and a final page, written not in Latin or English, but in a gentle scrawl. She wasn't alone, was she? He didn't answer, because by then, even asking was enough. Historians still argue whether the folding girl was singular or symbolic, a real person or a composite of many half-forgotten women who thought too clearly in an age that rewarded fog. Some dig through archives, others comb through marginalia in forgotten books. They always come up with fragments, never the whole. But in places like Elversbrook, the debate doesn't matter. The girl had become something more permanent than fact. She had become the instinct to write in the margins, the impulse to map shadows, to measure wind, to question patterns others deemed too small to notice. In a small village to the west, a group of school children were caught drawing concentric circles in the frost on their desks. When asked why, the youngest said, "It helps me think." No one taught them that. Not allowed. And in an abbey far to the south, a nun copied an old diagram into the corner of a fresh manuscript. She didn't know what it meant, but her grandmother had shown her how once, when they were very small. Somewhere in a drawer, folded between linens, a tattered page shows a wheel and a mirror, and the folding girl, whoever she was, however she began, remains, not in statues or songs, but in the silent pattern of questions that refuse to disappear. They say she died somewhere quiet, not in fire or exile, not at the hands of a priest or steward, just quietly, like a page turned without notice, a breath exhaled in the dark, but even that is uncertain. No grave bears her name, no death record, no mention in the chronicles of plague or war. She simply faded, not as vanishing, but as saturation, like ink in water, everywhere, all at once. There are places still that claim her bones lie beneath their chapels, towns that insist the well she drank from still tastes of iron and stars. But the village that knew her best never marked her end, because she had already become something else. Long before her body vanished, her work had scattered, copied, misunderstood, revised, and yet it carried her cadence. In a treatise on moss growth, in a diagram of the moon's pull on wet clay, in lullabies where no melody repeats, but everyone ends the same way, with a wheel. Not all of them were accurate. Some were nonsense, some dangerous. A few, remarkably true, but none carried her name. Only the trace of a mind that didn't try to solve the world, just to notice it better. You would have felt it had you stood in her cottage after her leaving, the air still arranged for thought, papers gone, but threads still hanging, stones still stacked, the wheel still etched faintly in the soot above the hearth. No note, no final word, just the echo of a life folded inward until the folds became openings, portals through which others could think a little more strangely, a little more clearly than the world usually allows. Historians still argue whether the girl ever existed, whether her story was myth, her work a patchwork of clever villagers misremembered as one. Some say she was an idea first, and only afterward made flesh. But in villages like Elversbrook, they don't argue. Each winter, they still mark the solstice with a single unlit candle in the chapel. It's not blessed, it's not lit, it just stands there, waiting, as if someone might walk in, point to the wax, and say, "This shadow is 2 minutes too long," as if the girl had never left, because in a way, she hadn't. She had simply folded herself into every place that noticed more than it explained, into every mind that drew a wheel and whispered, "There's something here." The village rests now. Even the chapel windows, long rattled by frost and bell chimes, hold still in the silence. The wheel above the well creaks once in the breeze, then settles, and somewhere, beneath the roots of the old yew, paper softens into earth. Not lost, just returning. She is not here anymore, but that doesn't mean she is gone. You've walked with her tonight, through soot and silence, breath and ink, memory and ash. And even now, as the story closes, her presence lingers, not as character or name, just as a sense that the world might still contain questions too beautiful to answer. So let that thought hold for a moment longer. Breathe slowly now. Let the diagrams fade, the lines of light on your ceiling soften, the shadows behind your eyelids drift wide, then still. And if the air feels heavier, it's only because some stories choose to rest with you a while longer. No need to understand it, only to feel it. That quiet, steady unfolding. The way meaning curves when no one is looking. The way a single mind, uncelebrated, unsheltered, can shift the weight of everything by noticing what others have been taught to ignore. So sleep now. The stars are still out there, drawing patterns no one owns. And somewhere, even now, someone is folding a page